All right, guys, happy Friday. Welcome back. Concepts of training, diving into reactivity and the nervous system. So we've talked about the nervous system in terms of stress, fatigue, just kind of a basic overview. When we talk about reactivity, that's one of those things that the nervous system is responsible for. And really, if you start to understand it, you can understand why it plays such a big factor in understanding how training is going to create stress and being able to understand how training is going to basically impact the nervous system and those fatigue levels. So when we look at reactivity, right, if you ever stuck your hand on something that's hot, right, like you have a burner on your stove, you touch the burner, your hand pulls back before you even feel the pain, right? Well, that reactivity, that loop, happens by when there's a nerve receptor, right, in your hand, and it runs all the way to your spinal cord. But before it even gets your spinal cord, right, your brain senses that something, or that nerve senses that something's wrong. There's an inhibition in the spinal cord, and it sends this reactive little loop. It's kind of the shortened autopilot-like little pathway, if you really want to think of it like that, where basically you're going to react and pull your hand back before your brain even senses the pain, right? Well, when we look at it in training, especially when we look at these different these different loops and different things we can look at in the gym. When we look at reactivity in the gym, we a lot of times look at explosive movements, right? So your tendons have these things called Golgi tendon organs, or basically these pressure receptors that sense stretch and pressure within a tendon. So when we look at reactivity, right, if I do a little low pogo movement here and I'm bouncing on the balls of the feet, well, really what I'm doing is just stretching this tendon. I'm creating this reactive moment where there's tiny little impulses of muscle contraction in my calves, right? My Achilles tendon is stretching out and I'm getting this tiny little contraction in my calves, right? And I'm getting this reactive little loop. So when we look at trying to create reactive movements or explosive movements, we're trying to utilize that stretch and that nerve reception in, a tendon to create a rapid muscle contraction to then reapply force and move in a different direction, right? So when we look at reactive movements, those are your jump roping movements, right? That's a very low reactive, but it is a reactive movement. Depth jumps, broad jumps, rebounding movements, right? Things where we have this rapid impulse, boom, 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 and we're getting these rapid impulses. These are our reactive movements, right? If I kind of drop onto one foot and then jump sideways, well, that's a reactive movement on that one foot, right? Boom, reactive movement. So when we look at training, right, these reactive movements can do two things. One, low reactive movements, and even some high reactive movements done in low volumes can excite the nervous system, so we increase the rate that our nervous system basically is conducting signals. Now, if I overdo it and go super high volume, we actually fatigue the nervous system, right? We talked about fatigue and how stress is stress. We're creating a stress response. So basically, we start to then fry the nervous system in order to kind of have that stress that's been placed upon it. So when we start to look at reactivity, understanding that you can use reactivity to a benefit, right? And especially as some kind of neural prep, like most of the workouts and training that I do with most people include some form of neural prep where we're kind of moving in that explosive manner, using something that's either very low reactive or maybe some very low volume, high reactive movements to excite the nervous system and get those nerve impulses moving quicker. But done in high volumes, say your sprints, right? Because a sprint in this position, well, if I hit the ground, have ground contact, and I'm sprinting, well, that movement all of a sudden then creates this reactivity, right? So high volumes of high full maximal velocity sprinting, right, is going to really drain the nervous system for those fatigue or into fatigue. So when we look at using reactive movements, understanding that in low doses they can excite the nervous system. In moderate doses, they're going to have some play into your training and the recovery needed. And then obviously in high volumes, you're going to need these massive recovery periods in order to then have a better training effect, or really just to regulate total volume in a training program. So reactivity, it's not always coming back to your brain, right? Like sometimes you don't have to actively think about it. We talked about, basically if I think I can move this right through, different, motor control and motor neurons. But when we look at overall fatigue, when we look at reactive movements, those are kind of those plyometrics, those bounds, jumps, different things where you're creating this real quick pressure stimulus. It's going up, hitting the spinal cord, shooting back down into the motor neurons and the motor pathways to cause short muscle contractions or rapid muscle contractions. That's what we're looking at when we're looking at reactivity. So that's just kind of that basic overview to kind of cap out our little overview on the nervous system. But just to kind of look at those, just general overview, fatigue, and then reactivity, and some of those main roles that the nervous system plays in your training.